It's really a pleasure to be here talking about accounting and also revisiting some very dear old friends. So thank you for being here. Today I'll be talking about the role, the importance of countries' macroeconomic conditions on the financial information that companies need to prepare and disclose to the public, to investors, to creditors, to general society. So the work I'm presenting here is joint work with some colleagues, namely Professor D.J. Nand and Professor Peter Wysowski. So I'll start by saying that there are many studies in different academic outlets, but also in reports by international organizations such as the World Bank or the EFRAG, which is an international European entity, and they all recognize that country characteristics such as the legal system in a country or how well the country is able to control corruption, how good the government is in effective implementing change, all these things seem to matter for financial decisions, that is for any business decision. So this is a reality that is well recognized both in academic studies, but also by regulators and important organizations all around the world. Just to give you a few examples, for example, there are studies, there are also reports saying that the political system in a country, so how democratic that country is, whether elections are taking place, all these aspects of the political system are known to be important for the quality of information that companies prepare. Another example is the legal system. So how well the law is defined and implemented is also very important, for example, for how firms define their capital structure. Or, for example, another more recent example is that firms' investment decisions seem, for example, to be associated with the level of trust that exists among individuals in society. So all of these country characteristics, which are just what characterizes the basic institutions of a country, seem to be very important for overall business decisions. And let me give you a few more examples of these characteristics or country institutions, just to make sure I explain clearly what I mean. So, for example, in the legal and regulatory field, studies acknowledge that how efficient the judicial system is, or how good the law is in protecting investor rights, creditor rights, property rights, and also how good the accounting and auditing rules are. All these things seem to matter for the quality of information that firms produce. Likewise, there are many studies and reports pointing to the importance of the banking system, the role of institutional foreign investors, the role of the media, and how developed information dissemination is in a country. And more recently, there has been a growing interest in other more, let's say, informal characteristics of a country, such as cultural values and sociological values. So before I mentioned to you the example of studies that show that how individuals trust each other has implications for how businesses are run, and in particular, the type of information they produce. So there has been a growing interest in these more sociological cultural aspects of society. So, and there are many more. The tax regime, the political systems, even geography of the country seem to matter for business preparation of financial information. So my presentation today is about all these aspects and trying to understand whether they are all important, which ones are important, and how do we move forward since we already know they are important. From the financial information point of view, there has also been acknowledged by international organizations such as the ones I mentioned, but others, such as the ISB, which is the international entity responsible for issuing accounting rules. So they all have recognized the importance of all these characteristics that I mentioned for the preparation and the quality of the financial information. So what we ask in this study that I have conducted with my colleagues is whether all these country characteristics are important and whether we can measure the individual importance of each one of them, since there are so many and growing, for the quality of the financial information. So for example, can I identify the specific influence of trust or religiosity or the legal system in the quality of financial information? So these are the questions that we try to address in this study. And likewise, there's also a large interest both in academia but also in the business world and in general in society about the impact of a very important change in accounting, which was and still is the adoption in many countries of international accounting rules, the IFRS. So related to what I said, what we want to know is, given there are this multitude of country characteristics that go from legal systems to cultural values, is it enough to change the accounting rules, such as adopting this international set of rules, to immediately see improvements in the quality of financial information that firms prepare? So that's a question, as I said, that I try to answer. Now, we already know from other studies in accounting and in finance fields that when countries adopted IFRS, firms had benefit, for example, by having higher liquidity in their stock market. But these studies show that such increase in liquidity, for example, was not the same for all countries. In Europe, for example, some studies show that such benefits existed only when countries proactively implemented mechanisms to actually review the financial reports together with the implementation of IFRS, what we call enforcement. So it seems that there's maybe some other things happening together with IFRS for us to see benefits of this policy change. So these are the kind of challenges, the kind of questions that I'm raising today and I'm debating here with you. And in general, these are the kind of challenges that international economics literature is facing. So how did we address or try to address these questions, these challenges in this particular study that I'm presenting today? So we started by looking at what many studies, and especially in the fields of accounting, finance, and economics, what do they found, or what kind of country characteristics do they think are related to financial information quality? So out of that large list of characteristics, and these are just examples, what are the ones that are more commonly used in academic studies to justify or to explain improvement in the quality of financial information? So that's what we we started by doing. And we found about 70 country characteristics that go from the legal system, the masculinity in society, the level of tax evasion, etc., the level of capital markets development, etc. So there are about, in this academic studies, about 70 country characteristics that have been demonstrated to be linked to improvements in financial information. So then we ask, or we try to analyze whether these characteristics are individual characteristics or what is the relationship between them. Are they related? Can they be grouped? Do they represent the same underlying reality? So that's what we try to address. So I'll try not to, give you many numbers, but regardless of the numbers, I put in these tables just to give you a few examples of what I want to say. So here's a list of some of the characteristics that have been already studied as being drivers of better financial information. So, for example, the quality of the banking system in the country is known, according to these prior studies, to influence the quality of financial information. But then when we try to relate that with the many other characteristics, and as I said, we find at least 70, we realize that the banking system is highly related in statistical terms, correlated with many, many other characteristics. And let me give you another example. I mentioned before there is this growing interest in the influence of social and cultural values. So let's take, for example, the level of individualism in society. So individualism is the opposite of collectivism. So how individualist are people in societies? And that characteristic of countries seems to be related with, and that's on the left-hand side, right-hand side, of the table. For example, with GDP, which is an economic indicator. It also seems to be related with the political environment. So, for example, it's very related with the quality of democracy in a country. And it's also related with the flows of foreign investors, and perhaps a little bit surprising, is also related with the level of English proficiency of the population in the country. And I could give you many more examples. So overall, what this first analysis shows is that, in fact, all these things seems to be very, very related. If you look at the numbers that I marked in red, the maximum number you would have there is 1. So you can see how close the numbers are to 1. And also, very importantly, it doesn't seem that we can group these country characteristics into the traditional buckets. So say, for example, here are the characteristics have to be that are related with law. And here are the characteristics which have to do with economic growth. It doesn't seem to work like that, because you see, individualism is something very deep-rooted in our own personal way of life. And it seems to be related with language, but also democracy and also economic growth. So that's our first take from this study. We then try to move a little bit forward and try to understand, well, if this is all related, how do we go from here? How do we then, in practice, study accounting information and the importance of countries' macro-level variables on accounting information? So we try to group these characteristics that now we know are very connected into groups. And the idea is that if we can somehow simplify all these 70 or more or hundreds of variables into more simple groups, that would make our life, both in academia and also for policy making, easier to try to move forward. So we did something that in statistics we call a factorial analysis, which is basically putting everything together into a certain algorithm, a certain method, and that method tells us what are the common bases across all these different characteristics. And what we found is that, in fact, although there are many, many country characteristics, only, for example, only 4 common groups are enough to explain about 58, that's the number on the bottom, 58%, let's say about 60% of the variation in international variation in these institutional or country characteristics. So it seems that although there are many, and there will always be more measures of countries' characteristics, they all have a common base because they are so connected, and we can actually group them. And to simplify, in this study, we didn't give names to these groups of characteristics. We just called them group 1, 2, 3, and 4. And of course, if you're really interested in all the mathematics or statistics behind it, I'm happy to show you what variables go in which group, but that's, I think, not the point here. So this is another takeaway from this study. So in fact, there is a panoply, a multitude of characteristics, but there are common bases that can be summarized in 4 major groups. And what can I do with this now? Well, for example, I can take one of these groups of variables, say group 1, and group 1 has many variables that characterize the legal aspects, but also the capital markets aspects. And it seems to explain about 30%, 0.3 of the whole international variation in countries' conditions. And I can use that group of characteristics to, for example, to rank countries. And what this example shows me is that, for example, Scandinavian countries seem to score high in terms of these country macro level conditions, which is not surprising, right? This is what we hear every day in the news, that how good institutions work in the Scandinavian countries. And then on the other end, you have countries like Philippines, Pakistan, Indonesia, which is also kind of what we expect. And Spain, I marked there, is somewhere in the middle. And Portugal, unfortunately, it's behind Spain. Then what we do next is we look into the financial decision of our interest, which is the quality of financial information. So this is what we are going to focus on this study. Out of all the possible financial firm decisions that these country characteristics influence, we are particularly interested in the quality of financial information. So we're going to kind of do the same approach. We look into the literature, we look into the accounting rules. For example, we looked at the ISB conceptual framework. where they define what is quality of accounting information. And we identify about 6 measures or characteristics, if you want, of financial information that have been widely used in reports and academic studies. So, for example, how good is it, or how fast is accounting in representing good and bad news that are happened in the business? That's called timeliness. Or, for example, how good are accounting numbers for decision making, for example, for investors? And that's reflected usually in the relationship between earnings, which is an accounting number, and the returns in the stock market. So we put all these characteristics together and we ask the same question. Are these really different characteristics, or are they just different measures for the same underlying firm quality of information in the firm? So we performed again our method of factor analysis, and indeed we conclude that although there are different perspectives of looking into quality of financial information, they in fact represent the same concept. And again, this simplifies our life for the future, because it kind of says, well, all these measures are related. You can take any, and if you don't have one available, maybe you can use the other, depending, of course, what is the purpose of the study. But that's what we're trying to say, that they are related and representing the same quality of information produced by firms. And again, what can you do with it? Well, you can rank firms, you can rank countries also based on the quality of the information that the companies prepare. And now you may ask, well, and what are the real economic implications of all this? This is all, oops, sorry, I'm going too fast. Sorry about this. Okay, here. So you may ask, what are the real implications of this? And I just want to give you a very quick example. So recently there has been a few studies of certain interest in a new measure of countries' characteristics, which is called economic freedom. And this is just produced by a foundation called the Heritage Foundation, and they try to measure how free this country is in terms of their social and financial conditions. So it's a measure of freedom in a country. And you may think, here's a new aspect of countries' macroeconomic conditions. Let's see whether this new measure matters for the quality of financial information. And then you would proceed, perhaps doing a statistical, empirical study, and you would relate this economic freedom with financial reporting quality, one of the measures or all the measures that I mentioned before. And if you put that in a statistical algorithm, you find out that indeed it seems very related. And you can, if you don't remember your statistics anymore, you can simply look at the asterisks or stars next to the numbers, and the idea is the more stars there is, the stronger the relation is, and the maximum number of stars is 3. So you can see that economic freedom has the maximum relation with accounting quality because it has the maximum stars or asterisks, which is 3. So you would conclude, that yes, freedom in a country does matter for the quality of financial information prepared by firms. But you can then proceed and knowing that all these characteristics and conditions are related, the next question that would come to your mind perhaps would be, well, but is it really economic freedom? Or maybe economic freedom is already related with something else that has been captured previously when I condensed all those things into those common factors. So I try to do that exercise, and in statistical terms, I simply add up my country factors 1, 2, 3, and 4 to my algorithm, and I want to see what happens now. And what happens is, as you can see, they can, oh, here I go again. This one, sorry. I think I'm too close to the keyboard, that's why. So what you can see is that the number of stars next to economic freedom in the last column, the red number, is 0. So there are no stars, means economic freedom doesn't matter anymore. So I was wrong. And I was wrong because all the stars are now in country factor 1, 3, and 4. So once you, because economic freedom is so much related to everything else, there's nothing more to explain. So everything else has already captured whatever this freedom measure is trying to capture. So the bottom line here is, it's going to be very, very hard for me to say, oh, here's something else that exists in a country, and it seems such a nice new characteristic. Let's try and see whether that new characteristic explains quality of information, or maybe investment policy, or something else. Now, because of this very strong interrelationship between the macro conditions in the country, that's going to be very, very hard. Now, likewise, for policy changes, such as the one I mentioned before, the introduction of a new set of accounting rules, for example, IFRS, we're going to have to ask the same questions. So all those studies and reports and statements, even by politicians in the European Union, saying, for sure, when you adopt IFRS, companies will have better information, companies will have access to more funds for the business, or funds at a lower cost, so lower cost of capital. But then now we know that many things are related. So is it really IFRS that is making companies producing better financial statements, or there are many other things out there happening at the same time? Because we know now it's difficult to isolate effects of one unique change or characteristic in a country. So just to give a little bit of an illustration to this issue, because IFRS adoption has been a very important event, and it has attracted a lot of attention, not just in academia, but in real business world. So it's an important event, and we keep on studying its effects. So I'm going just to, with this small picture, to illustrate what I mean. So this new set of accounting standards was introduced in Europe in 2005. But if we look around, there were many things happening at the same time in Europe. Not only IFRS was introduced, and that was a directive, so it was imposed, but there were many other laws and changes and regulations and directives being imposed across Europe. I have a few examples: the Market Abuse Directive, the Transparency Directive. There was lots of directives that aimed to improve investor rights. And if you want to go as back as 1999, you can even say that this introduction of new accounting rules is just a byproduct of something that was prepared many years ago in 1999, which was in Europe, which was the Financial Services Action Plan. So many academics, many people argue that in fact IFRS is just a result of this this decision that happened a long time ago. And then we can continue even after IFRS, where we are now measuring all the benefits for firms, and we say they are due to IFRS. There are still things going on, new directives. And on top of that, individual countries are also changing their legal system, their rules in the stock market, the rules for cross-border investment, and many other things. There are elections in all those European countries happening at the same time, and sometimes elections change the balance of power, and policy decisions then follow up that change in power. So there are so many things going on, and these are just examples that is difficult to really say that whatever we observe in terms of the quality of financial information is truly and only due to IFRS. So we then proceed in our study to try to show that with numbers, with some statistical tests, and we kind of do the same thing we did with the example of the economic freedom. So, but this time we focus on changes happening in other aspects of the macro level conditions. So we looked at whether the IFRS adoption alone would be important to explain positive change in the quality of financial information around the world in about 35 countries. And indeed, you see maximum number of stars over there, 3 stars. So yes, very important. IFRS did improve the quality of the financial information prepared by firms. But now that I know that many other things, as my previous graph illustrate, now that I know that many other things have changed, what will happen to this IFRS effect if I throw in all these other changes? Say political changes, changes in rules in the stock market, GDP changes, all that, media coverage, etc. Now, as you can see, the IFRS is no longer important because I now consider all other sets of things that happened more or less at the same time. So it's essentially the same message. It's very difficult to isolate the effect of one single policy change because governments, politicians, policymakers, those that govern countries, they don't take decisions ad hoc or randomly or individually. They usually are in packages, as we know. And just to give you more concrete examples, for example, what we observe is that during the period of IFRS adoption, 29 out of 30 countries have implemented enforcement actions. That is, they have created entities or restructure some local entities to review and sometimes even fine companies for not producing good financial documents. Another thing that we observe is that during the IFRS period, there is a lot more activity in terms of capital flows flowing into countries. We also noted that there's the GDP growth, economic growth, is higher in the period of IFRS adoption as compared to other periods that we include in our analysis. So this kind of suggests that what I previously mentioned, that these decisions to change one of these country characteristics, in this case accounting rules, is not taken randomly. There seems to be a spike or a peak of changes happening all at the same time. And that is what is actually making the effects that we observe on firms' behavior, such as improvements in the quality of the financial information that firms produce. So, overall, what this exercise with the IFRS adoption shows is that indeed policy interventions, new regulations, new systems that countries try to implement, they are not random, they are not isolated, they are usually in response to something. So, for example, IFRS adoption or the introduction of these accounting rules in Europe, you may see it as a response to the previous European directives that were aiming for better transparency. So it's a result of something. Often, policy interventions are a result of, say, scandals or financial crisis or a collapse of a bank or very bad economic conditions. And usually we also know that typically these big changes in the country's conditions are taken in good periods. That is when GDP is growing more and when the political environment is favorable. And that kind of didn't surprise us because we know from other fields of research, for example, in political science, they already shown that many of the economic decisions taken by governments are taken when the political situation is favorable. For example, not very close to elections, because if it's something that is going to change the way people organize their businesses, this may have negative effects on elections. So this didn't surprise us that the period of IFRS adoption coincide with some higher economic growth and some changes, for example, in more capital flows across countries. So this is more or less what we've done in this study. I hope I was sufficiently clear and interesting. So just in a nutshell, to summarize the key messages, what we show is that country conditions, the institutional environment, the macro level characteristics that characterize societies, they cannot be seen in isolation because they all basically interrelated, and these interrelations are very, very high. We show that economic, financial, social, legal, cultural, these are all related. You cannot say economics is not related with culture or language because it's just the different faces of the same reality. We also showed that you can group some of these characteristics to very simple groups of variables or conditions. And it is very difficult to attribute any effects on business of one unique macro level change. So what's next? So what we suggest is that for future studies, for future policy thinking, that we should consider countries as having groups of conditions that seem to be very, very related. So we should not treat economic freedom or individualism or masculinity or the legal system per se, but as connected to a group of other things that tend to be together. It's also quite important to understand the context, the setting where changes are happening. So, for example, the introduction of IFRS in Europe, it's important to understand and maybe go back even 20 or 30 or 50 years to understand why have countries decide to implement this common set of accounting rules? So the context is important. And finally, as a suggestion, we believe that perhaps follow-up studies could look at longer time series information. So we're now at a time where access to big data is becoming easier. So one possibility is to use more data that goes back maybe 100 years and is much more detailed to try to unveil, to understand better these trends, how these characteristics tend to move together, how are policymakers making decisions, what are the policy change that seem to matter, and in which circumstances they seem to matter. So this was the conclusion of our studies and ideas for the future. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very happy to answer any questions or hear your suggestions and comments. Thank you.